Peter Zeihan is a geopolitical strategist with a popular YouTube channel who produces daily short videos about a wide range of topics, from Russian geography to Chinese demographics, often while hiking in Colorado. He may know a lot about geography and demographics, which would suffice if that's all he talked about. But sometimes he publishes pieces on CleanTech, a field he doesn't understand. Here I'm going to do a deep dive into two of his videos and correct his big mistakes or add important context that he's left out. There are lots of minor issues like confusing power with energy that I'm not going to bother with. I'm also not going to explore his motives. I don't know why he publishes videos that are so demonstrably wrong. First, who am I? My name is Andy Silber. I have a PhD in physics from MIT and have been an energy and climate activist for over 20 years. I'll include below a link to some of my writings on the topic. I've also worked on product development for even longer, and I'll provide a link to my website in case you're interested in my professional background. At no point will I expect you to just believe me when I disagree with him. I'll provide references for everything with links in the description, something he doesn't do. First, I'm going to review Why EVs Aren't the CleanTech Panacea, which was published on November 2nd, 2023, in which Zeihan disses the electrification of cars while wearing a cute hat in a snowstorm. I've edited his video, and the link to the original video is below.
The news of the moment is that a lot of major auto manufacturers are scaling down their plans to make electric vehicles. Ford and GM have both canceled plans to build a couple new facilities for battery and EV assembly. Tesla has indicated a significant drawdown in their global production capacity, and in fact, they're saying they're going to suspend and maybe even cancel the plans for the gigafactory that they were going to be building in Mexico.
His first point is that we can't build EVs fast enough and that companies are losing interest in building them. The two main examples he gave, Ford and GM, are not significant players in the global EV market, not even cracking the top 10. Tesla is, but Zeihan didn't say that they were reducing production, only delaying building a particular plant.
These vehicles require an order of magnitude more stuff, more copper, more molybdenum, more lithium, obviously, graphite. And the energy content required to put those into process is where most of the energy cost comes from. But the more important thing is if we're going to convert the world's vehicle fleets to these things, there's just not enough of this stuff on the planet.
When comparing the inputs to build an EV versus a standard internal combustion engine or ICE vehicle, you can split it into three aspects: the battery, the electric motor, and everything else, like tires and seats and windshields. The batteries are definitely an issue, but an electric motor is easier to build and takes less stuff than what it replaces. No spark plugs, transmission, lubricating oil, gaskets, or pistons. And everything else is unchanged. So it's just about the batteries. And these batteries have gotten much easier to build. As we can see here, from 1996 to 2016, the cost of lithium batteries has dropped by a factor of at least 20 and continues to drop. Mining and refining cobalt is an issue, so Tesla is now building batteries without cobalt. All of the EV forecasts factor in the challenges and opportunities of building batteries.
Humanity has never doubled the production of any industrial material at any time in history within a 10-year period if it was something we were using before.
I'm not sure what Zeihan means here, but I can think of a situation where we greatly increased the production of a product in less than 10 years. We went from building nearly 0 tanks in 1939 to 40,000 in 1943. I'm not saying it was easy, nor will the green transition be, but to say that it is unprecedented is just not true.
There just aren't enough charging stations.
We definitely need more charging stations, but not by a huge amount. When I bought my Nissan Leaf with a 65-mile range, I charged it in my garage with just a standard outlet. I also could charge it at work if needed. We called it our King County car and used our Subaru for longer trips. For two-car families that have off-street parking, one of those cars could easily be an EV. Charging stations at grocery stores and malls are now common, and some cities like Seattle are starting to build charging stations for on-street parking, all of which will help out people who can't charge at home. Now that we've adopted a single standard for charging plugs, it will make building a charging network even easier. The bipartisan infrastructure law allocated $2.5 billion to building out the charging infrastructure. So we're well on our way to having a national system that we need for charging.
We need to basically increase the amount of electricity generation and throughput of our system by about half. Well, let's call it 20 times more equipment when it comes to things like transformers and cables than we have done in 75 years.
There's an old saying that there's no such thing as a free lunch. So the energy needed to power the EVs has to come from somewhere. Zeihan's estimate of 50% more power required is reasonable if we convert all ICE cars to EVs. But this doesn't happen overnight. Some countries might prohibit the sales of new ICE cars by 2030, but even I think that's not going to happen. So let's say that by 2035, 100% of new cars are EVs, which is still on the optimistic side. No one is suggesting that working ICE cars be scrapped, so there will still be a significant number of ICE cars on the road for another 15 to 20 years, until at least 2050. So we have 30 years to upgrade the grid. Zeihan's correct that we've been underinvesting in the grid for decades, but that is not a reason that we can't start investing now and build up to the grid that we need. I have a whole video just about the opportunity for high voltage direct current that can make this job much easier. In the short term, there are grid enhancement technologies that can quickly allow more power to be transmitted without hanging any additional cables. And we can build a smarter grid that can charge cars or heat water when the grid is underutilized, which allows us to get more done with the grid we have.
Your typical EV, if you want to compare it to something that's an internal combustion, it really depends upon the model. The cheapest ones are going to still cost about $10,000 more than their equivalent. And so this is not a vehicle whose for most people. The real issue is that sales are down. People just aren't interested in EVs at the current time. But EVs are building up on the lots, and people just aren't buying them without absolutely massive discounts.
We can see from the graphic here that EV sales in 2023 have set a new global record. Even in the US, the sales broke a new record, but at a slower rate of growth and by reducing prices. If the American car industry ignores EVs, it's at risk of being left behind in this quickly growing segment. When was the last time you bought an IBM computer or a Timex watch? That might be the future for Ford and GM. An article from Morningstar titled, "We Forecast Global Electric Vehicle Sales to Quadruple by 2030" starts with, over the past couple of years, battery electric vehicles have seen a far faster adoption than consensus expected, and this growth can and will continue. So I don't know where Zeihan's doom and gloom comes from, and I don't see any evidence it's shared, both in terms of production or demand. I'm guessing it's because he believes that China is going to collapse any day now, significantly reducing both the production and demand of EVs.
They're not as reliable. They don't have the range. People are a little nervous about the technology in general.
The AAA did a study and found that the total cost of ownership for EVs was only slightly higher than ICE cars, since the higher purchase price was offset by lower fuel and maintenance costs. So I don't know what he means when he says that EVs aren't reliable. In the years that I owned my Nissan Leaf, all I did was replace an air filter. They also found that 96% of EV owners said they would buy or lease another electric vehicle, and that 78% also have a gas-powered car in the household, yet they report driving 87% of the time in their electric vehicle. That was definitely our experience.
And for me, a green who can do math, this couldn't come soon enough. Because there are so many more exotic materials, and because energy processing to make those materials is so much more energy intensive, all of this work is done in China. And in most places, it's done with either soft coal or lignite. So you're talking about an order of magnitude more carbon generated just to make these things in the first place compared to an ICE. From an environmental point of view, most EVs are at best questionable. The data that says they're slam dunk successes assumes that you're building the EVs with a relatively clean energy mix and then recharging it with 100% green energy. And that happens exactly nowhere.
From J.D. Powers, that bastion of green folks who don't do math, we have, quote, researchers have conducted many studies on the environmental impact of electric vehicles. The results of these studies consistently show that EVs provide emission benefits in nearly every circumstance compared with vehicles powered by internal combustion engines. This is called life cycle assessment, and I've not found a single one that agrees with Zeihan. For instance, here are the results of the analysis by the International Council on Clean Transportation, showing the base car has similar inputs, with the battery adding significant amount on top of that. But the impact of not burning gas greatly outweighs the impact of building the battery. I went to the EPA tool that calculates your CO2 emission from your fuel based upon the emissions from your local grid. I plugged in a zip code for West Virginia and said I was driving a Chevy Bolt. As you can see, even in West Virginia, your emissions are much lower for an EV than for an ICE car. And from the U.S. Energy Information Agency, we see that emissions from generating electricity have been dropping as wind and solar play a greater role in supplying our electricity, a trend that should continue. So the EV advantage will grow as we decarbonize our grid. So Peter Zeihan had 4 large points. We can't build EVs fast enough, we can't upgrade the grid fast enough, there isn't demand, and EVs aren't actually better for the environment. All of these claims are demonstrably false. That's not to say that having 100% of new cars sold by 2035 be EVs and then increasing our grid by at least 50% by 2050 is easy, but they are doable, and we've made equivalent achievements in the past. But if we look at the title of the video, why EVs aren't the Green Tech Panacea, rather than the content of the video, I completely agree. EVs are better than ICE cars, but they aren't a panacea. They don't solve congestion, the vast amounts of land taken up by roads and parking lots, or that about 38,000 people a year die in car accidents just in the United States. I'd much rather live in Amsterdam with good transit and biking infrastructure than in LA filled with EVs. Is hydrogen the future of energy? Is the second video. And for this one, I agree with Zeihan's conclusion, but there are several critical facts he gets very wrong. It was published on September 21st, 2023. And again, I'll be showing clips from the video, and the full video is linked below.
The question today is about hydrogen. The hydrogen economy, is it where we're going? Is it a farce? Will it save us all? Is it somewhere in between? It's somewhere in between. The whole idea is that when you burn hydrogen, you do not produce any sort of carbon. If you can move to a 100% hydrogen energy system, then the carbon question largely goes away. And on the back end, the math of that, the science of that is totally true, but that's the back end. There's the front end. Where do you get the hydrogen? Now, the goal is a 100% clean system where you are using solar and wind and hydropower.
Hydrogen from wind, solar, and hydropower is referred to as green hydrogen.
Maybe some nuclear to break apart water molecules.
While using nuclear for your energy source supplies purple or pink hydrogen. Chemically, they're the same. It's just how policy wonks like to talk about how we produce hydrogen.
And it should come as no surprise that water is one of the most stable chemical materials we have on the planet. It's 1 oxygen, 2 hydrogen atoms, and it's really hard to split them apart. So you have to inject a massive amount of energy into the system to do that.
What Zeihan says is correct, but misses an important point. It doesn't matter how hard it is to crack water. What matters is the efficiency. The energy spent in splitting the molecule apart is the energy you have available when you take hydrogen and oxygen and make water again, minus the efficiency. Typically, electrolyzers are about 75% efficient, though there are some pre-commercial stage companies with higher efficiency designs that might be ready soon. I recommend a recent video by Matt Farrell at Undecided for good coverage of what's around the corner.
And since with wind and solar right now, even by the most aggressive estimates, we're going to be nowhere near 100% green by 2050, much less replacing things like the transport system by 2050, there's never, ever going to be enough electricity generated from these sources this century in order to then be able to produce hydrogen at scale.
The policy of the Biden administration is to decarbonize the grid by 2035. And there are serious studies about what it will take to make that happen. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is already updating the permitting process, which will make it easier to build more transmission lines. And you can make the case, and I'm certain Zeihan would, that this is overly optimistic. But to say that, quote, by even the most aggressive estimates, we're going to be nowhere near 100% by 2050 is just incorrect. Part of the problem is that Zeihan conflates hard with impossible. Decarbonizing the grid by 2035 will be a challenge, but it requires no new technology or impossible amounts of inputs.
Let me go to the other side. The far side, the bottom, is fossil fuel sourced hydrogen. Basically, you vaporize coal or you pluck the hydrogen off of a natural gas molecule. Natural gas is a carbon atom with 4 hydrogens around it. But then you produce a lot of CO2 as a byproduct. So you're basically producing hydrogen, you're just burning a fossil fuel before you get to the actual energy source. And once you take into account things like transport and building out a parallel system to use the hydrogen, it's actually more carbon intensive than what we're doing now.
Now he's talking about black, brown, and gray hydrogen. And he's correct that using these sources of hydrogen would increase our emissions. But there's also turquoise and blue hydrogen where the carbon is captured and either used or sequestered. I'm not a big fan of these, but some interesting companies are working on pyrolysis that might pan out. And this is a technology that's worth researching, but not ready to roll out.
The only people who are doing hydrogen in this way are folks who are doing it as a test bed to see what they can do with hydrogen, and that requires some volume.
It seems like Zeihan doesn't realize that there's a hydrogen industry that's been around for decades. It's used in refining petroleum and producing fertilizer and metal, among other uses. But when people talk about the hydrogen economy, they're talking about several orders of magnitude more than we currently produce.
Which leads us to the bridge technology, potentially the middle step. And that is to take hydrogen from a ammonia molecule. Now, an ammonia molecule is a single atom of nitrogen surrounded by hydrogen molecules. Unlike hydrogen, which is a gas that is wildly explosive and difficult to contain because the molecules are so strong, so you couldn't use the pipelines we use currently to move hydrogen at scale. You'd have to build new ones, and they'd be much more expensive and much more dangerous. Ammonia has none of those problems. It can be compressed without making it explosive. If it does get out in the environment, it's not going to burn in the same way, if at all. And we already have a parallel system in the world to produce it at scale because nitrogen is one of the 3 main nutrients that we use in our fertilizers.
Zeihan gets something so fundamentally wrong here that it makes me wonder about his process. Ammonia is produced using the Haber-Bosch process, which combines hydrogen with atmospheric nitrogen. In other words, all of the concerns that Zeihan has about hydrogen production would apply to ammonia. As he said, ammonia is easier to store and transport than hydrogen, so it might make sense to convert some of the hydrogen to ammonia, at the very least sufficient to meet our current needs for fertilizer and other industrial processes. But it's not a bridge fuel, it's an element of the hydrogen economy.
So hydrogen, interesting? Yeah, I want to see some people tinker with that. But it is definitely not ready for prime time.
I do agree with Zeihan that hydrogen is not ready for prime time, but I do want to see people tinker with it. I also see that there is a role for hydrogen in the not too distant future. As we build a grid based on intermittent sources like wind and solar with zero marginal cost, we have two problems: times when we don't have enough production and times when we have too much. Energy storage and long-distance transmission can solve the first problem and help with the second. But having a fleet of electrolyzers on the grid that can fire up whenever there's an excess amount of power on the grid guarantees that there's always a customer for your power if you're considering building a wind or solar farm. There are also isolated locations with great renewable resources where producing hydrogen might make more sense than connecting the facility to the grid. For instance, it's easy to imagine a fleet of floating offshore wind turbines off the west coast of Ireland where the wind is always blowing, sending the power to a platform where hydrogen is produced. Every day or two, a tanker shows up, fills up their storage tanks with hydrogen or ammonia, destined for chemical plants in Germany or wherever there is demand. Zeihan's studies and experience are in political science, not chemistry and engineering. I'm not saying he should stay in his lane, but if you're going to talk into a camera and expect people to take you seriously, you should at least read the Wikipedia articles on the topic. And if you're going to state conclusions with such certainty, you should show your work. I'm not saying he needs to go through the footnotes on camera, but he could include more than a link to his Twitter feed in the video's description. If you've learned something in this video, please like and subscribe, and share with any fans of Peter Zeihan that you know.